Well, stick around, folks, as I tell you about the four most important things that came out of the arrest affidavit in the murder of Savanah Soto and baby Fabian. And yes, I'm going to include what the warrant told me about Matthew Guerra's murder as well. Well, thanks everybody for coming online and joining us here at Profiling Evil. The video I did yesterday on the triple murder in San Antonio, Texas, was released just hours before the arrest warrant was made public. I'm really glad to say that my theories, based on information that police were relaying as well as things that were in news reports, was on target. But that said, when I read the affidavit, a number of things stood out to me. So let's dig into those. First and foremost, the first thing that caught my attention in this newly released arrest warrant was that that victim list didn't include the baby, who's now been identified as Fabian or Fabian. It does identify the child's mother, Savanah Soto, and the alleged father, Matthew Guerra, as the victims in this case. And I have no reason to doubt that he's the father. In a statement by Bexar County District Attorney Joe Gonzalez just a short time ago, the DA made it clear that under Texas law, an unborn child is included in the definition of a person. That's why this is so big. Therefore, Christopher Preciado can be charged with an additional count of capital murder for the death of baby Fabian. Now, I thought it was interesting to note that in the discussion the DA had on Texas Public Radio, that he also said that if a grand jury indicts Christopher Preciado, the DA's office Capital Crimes Committee is going to consider whether they should seek the death penalty on this case. That's going to be really interesting. You know, the mere thought of this full-term fetus slowly dying after his mother's death is frankly just too much to talk about or to describe what that physical process is like. But my hope is that the DA moves swiftly to include the baby's death in the charges. And for those of you who've been wondering why it didn't happen, I suspect it's because they need an autopsy to confirm that the baby was alive at the time the mother died. I hope this baby is buried in his mother's arms. A social media enthusiast going by WWB captured this video where somebody snuck up to the Preciado home and spray painted baby killer on a vehicle that was out in the driveway. I'll tell you what, in my opinion, this is really poor form. It expresses our frustration, but please, folks, don't resort to this kind of behavior. Number 2, I found it interesting and frankly quite contrary to the comments that were made in the media that Soto's family didn't report Savanah missing until December 23rd. Now, the evidence in the case is showing that the murder occurred just 2 days earlier, just before midnight. That means they went 2 days without reporting, and I find it odd since the family's expressing how concerned they were for the young mother's health, given that she was already past her delivery due date. Now, they expressed publicly how concerned they were on social media and the fact that they were concerned that she was in the company of Guerra, who was reportedly abusive toward her in the past, including on Christmas Day a year earlier when he was arrested for domestic battery after assaulting Soto. You know, I'd like to add that Guerra is also on probation for the assault on Soto that ends in June of 2024, now obviously is gone, but he's also facing new charges of carrying a weapon, evading arrest, using a vehicle, and reckless driving. So that was a great post by Mariah Medina on Twitter. Make sure you check that out. Well, in the family's defense, there are reports that they were asking for help through social media. But again, I'm wondering why they didn't reach out to law enforcement. Talking through social media versus going to a public entity are two different things. That was number 2. Now, number 3, the affidavit clarified where each victim was discovered inside that 2013 Kia Optima that had been disposed by the alleged killer at the apartment complex. The affidavit identifies the pregnant female who they say resembled Soto sitting in the front seat with a gunshot wound to the head. Guerra was discovered in the back seat of the vehicle, also with a gunshot wound to his head. But this is really important because Preciado told investigators that he was struggling with Guerra right before the shooting. Guerra, according to him, produced a gun. The weapon in the fight discharged and the bullet struck Soto. Now, Preciado says that the two continued to fight and the gun again went off, killing Guerra. You know, there were a couple of problems with the scenario painted by Preciado and frankly, with the location where the victims are discovered. And this one, it's going to boil down to a couple of scenarios, in my opinion. So keep in mind, police have indicated in the arrest affidavit that Guerra appeared to have been dragged into the vehicle, evidenced by drag marks on his body and back and blood evidence outside of the car. Now, with this in mind, let's consider a couple of scenarios. And the first scenario I want to pitch is, as Preciado stated to police, Guerra and Soto came to his home to sell him some marijuana. An argument ensued, a fight broke out, and Preciado and Guerra fought over a weapon. Now, this seems to have some merit since Guerra was awaiting weapons charges in court, and family members also suggested that this is a guy who would post images of himself with drugs, money, weapons. I haven't seen those personally. I've only read about those reports, but the affidavit, it admits that spent shell casings were recovered inside the vehicle, but the murder weapon was never located. Now, if police have images of the weapon from Guerra's social media posts, and they have bullet forensics, it might be possible to judge whether the weapon and the bullet recovered or the casings recovered are similar in nature. Forensic examination should be able to identify where the rounds were fired around those victims as well, and how close the weapon was to each victim based on the stippling that occurs when they're close. Now, stippling is caused by unburned particles of gunpowder striking the skin, in contrast to other substances that might be deposited on the skin like soot. But stippling can't be washed away. It's burned in. The presence of stippling indicates that the muzzle of the gun was within 2 feet of the victim's body when it was fired. Now, if both victims were killed inside the vehicle, forensic evidence is going to support that theory. But we already know that there's blood evidence outside the vehicle. And this suggests that a violent act may have occurred outside the car. So, it's possible that the drug deal was going on outside the vehicle between Guerra and Preciado, while Soto sat in the front seat of the vehicle waiting. Now remember, this woman was full term with her pregnancy, so she's probably not too mobile. If Guerra and Preciado started fighting over the weapon, it's possible that the weapon discharged and struck Soto, just like Preciado described to police. Then, as they continued to struggle, the weapons fired again and Guerra was killed. Again, I think the physical characteristics of both men is going to play into this in a big way, determining the probabilities and the possibilities of whether one could overpower the other. Now, here's an important revelation from the arrest affidavit, though. If it's correct, the affidavit suggests that Soto and Guerra were at the Preciado home for only 4 minutes. Now, Soto's mobile phone data suggests that they arrived at 23:50 hours. Soto's mobile phone was moving again at 23:54, 4 minutes later, when it traveled directly from the place where they were killed to where their bodies were discovered at the apartments. Now, if this is accurate, Preciado wouldn't have had very much time to put a plan in place and to act it out. Not only that, he wouldn't have time to come up with a strategy to dispose of the victims or destroy or conceal the murder weapon. So this makes me wonder about premeditation, although I've seen crazier things happen with these disorganized crime scenes as the predator tries to symbolically wash their hands of the problem and get rid of it. Remember, though, Police investigators are theorizing that the two adult victims were killed in separate locations. So this one is going to boil down to physical evidence in order to have clarity on the issue. Now, scenario number 2. I'm wondering if Guerra was simply shot and killed by Preciado in an attempt of robbery or maybe even in anger. I believe forensics will be able to tell us who loaded the weapon by collecting DNA from the casings that are found on the ground, inside the vehicle, or still inside the weapon if it's ever located. Forensic examiners could also collect evidence from the weapon's magazine, which stores the unspent bullets inside the gun. These could provide a lot of information about who handled those rounds. But the defense will quickly say to defeat the evidence, Preciado would only need to say that he unloaded the weapon after the murders and manipulated the parts, and that's why his fingerprints were on that. Now, if Preciado executed Guerra outside the vehicle while Soto remained inside, it's possible that she didn't even hear the shot. And this kind of an answer can come by looking at behavior. How loud did Soto normally have the car's sound system when she was driving around? Once this autopsy is completed, it's going to reveal the direction in which the victims were shot, and it's going to bring clarity to this scenario of what really unfolded. Now, the fourth thing that really jumped out at me in this affidavit is the timeline and the father's involvement in this case. One of the biggest things that jumped out to me in the affidavit was the timeline of events as it pertained to Ramon Preciado's involvement. Remember, Soto's phone suggests that the couple arrived at the residence around 23:50. There was only 4 minutes before the vehicle was driven to the apartments and where the bodies and the victim's car would be recovered 5 days later. Now, here's the real interesting piece of behavioral evidence that comes out of the arrest affidavit. It appears to me that Ramon must have followed his son, who was incidentally driving the deceased victim's car, over to the apartments where they cleaned the car and discarded it. Now, I say this because Ramon Preciado pulls into the apartment complex where he's seen on video wiping down the side of the car at 23:59 hours. That's only 5 minutes after Soto's phone indicated they were moving from the scene of the murder to the disposal site. Now, in this image and map that I placed on a timeline of the arrest affidavit and the route that they most likely took, they arrived at the Preciado home at 11:50 p.m. 4 minutes later, at 11:54, the murders had happened, and Soto's mobile device was indicating that they were on the move again, now heading toward the apartments where those bodies were discovered. It appears, by looking at the map, that there's only a 3-minute drive on average, and the affidavit doesn't say what time the victim's vehicle arrived at the disposal site, but it does tell us that Ramon Preciado pulls in and meets his son, who's driving the victim's car, at 11:59 p.m. In total, only 9 minutes elapse from the time Soto and Guerra arrive at the Preciado home, get murdered, and then get disposed of at the apartments. So my original question about whether Ramon was home at the time of the shooting seems to be answered. He was there, and he followed him. And I want to know your thoughts. Now, I'm going to be looking for your comments below on this one. This is a perfect example, and frankly, reason for my caution on theorizing too much before information comes out. And holy cow, the information on this case is really interesting. Now, I can't wait to hear what is learned in that autopsy and what's later revealed in court. But here's another question for you. Do you think Preciado told police what he did with the gun? And who do you think brought the gun to the drug deal? It's really tragic to think that a mother, her child named Fabian, and the dysfunctional man who fathered her child won't be around to answer some of these questions. Thanks for listening, folks. We'll see you soon at the next crime scene.